In the long and blood-soaked memory of Southeast Asia, one name is spoken whenever men dare speak of military genius, the kind that transforms the outmatched into the destroyer of empires. Raden Wijaya was not a king by bloodline when the Mongols came. He was an obscure prince standing upon the smoldering ruin of a shattered realm, a political order already gutted from within long before any foreign iron arrived. He was born in the shadow of the Singasari court, that Javanese kingdom forged by King Kertanagara through iron and doctrine and blood, raised to dominance across the archipelago before treachery drove its blade into the kingdom's unguarded flank. Kertanagara had done what many considered a form of sacred madness. He publicly humiliated Kublai Khan's envoy, mutilating the man's face and sending him back, bearing the only message Java would ever deliver: "We kneel to no dynasty on earth." Yet Java had not finished its own wars when Kublai Khan's fleet began cutting southward through the dark water, carrying 20,000 Mongol warriors, Chinese mercenaries, and Vietnamese conscripts toward shores still bleeding from internal betrayal. Wijaya stared into the abyss with both eyes open. A foreign armada of terrifying scale approaching from the sea, a treacherous usurper named Jaya Ketwang seated upon the stolen throne, and a scattered people with no coherent vanguard to face either threat. It was in that abyss, where lesser men watched their banners fall and their walls crack and their gods go silent, that something ignited in Wijaya's mind, something deeper than courage, more dangerous than despair, and colder than any tactical calculation. He saw what none around him could perceive, that both enemies could be annihilated with a single blow, but the road to that annihilation passed through a shadow only the boldest commander would dare inhabit, choosing to hide in the hurricane's eye itself. His reading of the Mongols was surgical, the precision of a general who understands not just what his enemy carries, but what his enemy cannot see. They came seeking vengeance for a dead king, blind to the changed throne, blind to the terrain awaiting their doom. The tropical jungle is not the open steppe. The damp and suffocating thicket is not the Mongolian plain. The torrential rains are not the winds of the grasslands, and arrows fired from darkness between ancient roots are not the facing cavalry lines the horde calls war. So Wijaya sent a delegation to the approaching armada, bearing neither sword nor shield, carrying instead a declaration so precisely crafted that it constitutes perhaps the finest act of psychological warfare the Eastern world has ever recorded. We are with you. Your true enemy now sits on our stolen throne, and these jungles, I hold every key to every passage within them. The Mongol fleet made anchor off the northern shores of Java in the early months of 1293. Dropping anchor the way empires always do, certain of victory before a single soldier has touched the hostile earth. 20,000 soldiers, 500 warships. This was not a military campaign. This was Kublai Khan's formal declaration that Java would pay the full price for every insult hurled at the Mongol banner and at the dynasty stretching from China to the Caucasus. Mongol commander Ike Messe sat aboard his flagship, mentally mapping the lines of a battle whose conclusion he considered already written, for the Mongol doctrine had never learned to expect surprise from a man who arrives offering alliance and smiling surrender. Wijaya's delegation climbed aboard the flagship and delivered its address with precise and masterful construction. Yes, we served the king who insulted your envoy, but that king is dead. Jayakatwang, the true enemy, now holds the throne, and this land awaits your justice." The Mongols seized those words as a starving man seizes bread, and Ike Messe, for all his battlefield experience across a dozen conquered territories, failed entirely to see the thread pulled taut in the darkness, held by a hand that did not tremble. The Mongol commander accepted the alliance and redirected his forces, and in that single moment, the campaign transformed from a punitive expedition against a dead king's memory into a proxy war where the horde unknowingly bled for a prince already sharpening the blade for their own necks. The combined force, Mongol and Javanese, advanced along the jungle tracks toward Jayakatwang's capital, the Mongols marching with the heavy confidence of those who have never lost, not yet realizing the ground beneath their iron boots was the woven floor of a trap.
The Javanese jungle is not merely dense foliage and wet embankments. It is an entire sovereign world where paths cross like nets and roots interlock like snares, where humidity corrodes iron armor and warps bowstrings and robs war horses of their footing and their nerve. The Mongol warrior reached his terrifying zenith, mounted on the open plain under a vast and unobstructed sky, able to see the enemy, to read the empty earth behind him, all his tactics built on velocity and space and the infinite horizon, now stolen by Java's crushing canopy. Wijaya knew every secret of this terrain. He was born and raised within these forests, had learned from boyhood where the seemingly solid ground dissolved into swallowing mud, where the paths narrowed until only one man could pass, where the shadow became a weapon. He dispatched encrypted instructions to his commanders hidden throughout the villages along the route, marking positions and timing and signal codes, a complete theater of war assembled in absolute silence, while the Mongols marched deeper into it, hearing nothing but jungle sound. Jayakatwang's forces, seeing the combined army approach, retreated inward to their fortifications, not from cowardice, but because no intelligence had yet reached them of the vast conspiracy unfolding behind the curtain, granting the appearance of victory to men who wanted only to manufacture their own trap. The Mongols drove deep in pursuit of Jayakatwang, marching further and further from their anchored ships, deeper into the web of forest, further from the sea that was their only lifeline, celebrating the phantom triumphs of a battle they believed was already theirs. When the campaign against Jayakatwang concluded and the Mongol forces came stumbling back through the jungle, drenched in sweat and tropical mud, their armor heavy with the oppressive weight of equatorial heat, Wijaya stood at the crossroads he had designed from the very beginning, 0 hour. Wijaya greeted the returning Mongols with the performance of celebration, painting before their exhausted eyes the vision of a victory feast waiting in the nearest settlement, urging them to disperse and take their well-earned rest after their noble service to the alliance. And there, in that precise moment when a Mongol warrior unstrung his bow and tethered his horse and reached to lift the iron helmet from his aching skull, the mechanism Wijaya had built with the patience of a master craftsman was triggered and could not be stopped. Wijaya's forces erupted from every breach in the jungle simultaneously, from north, south, east, and west, as though the ancient trees themselves had transformed into warriors bearing poisoned spears and arrows loosed by hands that did not waver and did not miss. What followed was not, in any honest military sense, a battle. It was systematic annihilation conducted in the shadow of the jungle canopy, where the Mongol soldier could not process what was happening because his entire doctrine was built upon open ground and visible enemies. The Mongol blade requires space to sweep. The lance requires level earth to lower. The cavalry charge requires kilometers of unobstructed plain, and all of it had been stolen now, consumed by Java's ancient root systems and bamboo thickets that shattered every formation before it could breathe. Wijaya released his war-trained war elephants directly into the Mongol formations, immense and terrible animals that moved through the tree line as naturally as water moves through stone, while the Mongol war horses met them with screaming, uncontrollable, ungovernable terror. The Mongols found themselves imprisoned inside a vast green dungeon with no gate, no window, and no exit. Each man hunted by enemies who appeared only to kill and then dissolved back into the dense and lightless canopy that their step-trained eyes could not penetrate. Terror, that magnificent and ancient weapon the Mongols had wielded against every civilization from China to Poland, had turned in their hands like a blade without a hilt, and the dread they had spent a century sowing in other peoples now moved through their own blood.
The Mongols lost their legendary tactical discipline, that iron doctrine which had broken every army that dared face them in formation, because there was no solid ground beneath their feet, no readable horizon before their eyes, no coherent line of maneuver in the smothering tangle of the forest. Wijaya had positioned his archers along every viable retreat corridor, raining volleys upon every Mongol formation that attempted to regroup and reconstruct itself, dismantling each attempt at order before it could harden into anything resembling coordinated resistance. Wijaya himself observed the battle from an elevated position on a jungle ridge, issuing precise commands through smoke signals and the measured rhythm of war drums, a secret martial language understood by every Javanese fighter and utterly incomprehensible to the men dying below. Mongol units that pressed northward ran into prepared ambushes of terrifying density. Those retreating westward fell into concealed pit traps buried beneath leaves and jungle debris, and every officer who attempted to rally his men drew a concentrated volley that dissolved his formation instantly. This was not the Mongol battlefield, no open ramp descending to the horizon, no step measured in leagues, no distance suitable for the feigned retreat, no enemy standing in opposing ranked lines the way every Mongol strategist had ever imagined honorable war. The jungle combat ran entirely by the jungle's own logic. Those who knew its passages lived, and those who did not were slaughtered, and every man who believed himself advancing may have been walking in circles toward the ambush laid by someone who knew every root and every shadow of this dark green world. The Mongol dead in those drenching, blood-stained hours numbered far beyond what any imperial chronicle would ever permit. Figures that remained unrecorded because the shame of admission was heavier than any army commander could bring himself to carry back to the Khan. The battle continued until blood mixed with the red tropical mud, and the air grew thick with the smell of scorched iron and the coming rain and something older than either. the particular scent of a military doctrine meeting the abyss it never knew existed and could not survive. When the Mongols reached the absolute threshold of collapse, when every semblance of order and strategy had vanished from their minds, and the possibility of victory had become a foreign concept, Vijaya released his reserves from two opposing flanks simultaneously, hammer and anvil closing upon molten iron that had lost its shape. The pressure was psychological before it was physical, because a soldier stripped of his battlefield logic cannot fight regardless of his muscle and his iron courage, when he no longer knows the direction of the coming blade or the shadow from which the next spear will emerge. The Mongols began their retreat, not the disciplined, feigned withdrawal that was their celebrated tactical signature, but the unraveling, panic-driven flight of men whose doctrine had failed them, abandoning comrades to the jungle's depths and heavy weapons too cumbersome to carry in the desperate scramble. Vijaya's forces pursued them to the very edge of the tree line without granting them a single breath of recovery, relentless as a tide that does not chase a man to save him, but to ensure that the drowning is complete and without any possibility of reversal. The Mongols who reached their ships carried something on their bodies they had not carried since the Mongolian plains of their own bloodline's origin, the wounds of genuine defeat, the kind that cut deeper than flesh and leave marks upon the memory of an entire military tradition. The Mongol armada raised its anchors that day without vengeance, without tribute, without the conquest it had sailed 5,000 miles to accomplish. The ships departing laden not with plunder, but with broken pride and the blood of men who died in a forest no Mongol general had ever planned to die within. The fleet departed Java in the summer of 1293, and not a single vessel bearing the banner of Kublai Khan ever returned to those shores, because the Mongol memory preserved this island's name as a scar upon the body of a legend that had believed itself beyond wounding. Java marked, furthermore, the final chapter of Kublai Khan's entire program of maritime expansion, preceded by the catastrophe of Japan, the defeat in Vietnam, the repulse at Champa, as though the sea itself had decided in those decades to be the absolute boundary that no steppe empire could cross.
In the silence left behind by the departing armada, Wijaya unsheathed his sword not to face an external enemy, but to complete the work the trap had begun, the surgical removal of the betrayal that still sat upon the stolen throne of his kingdom. He launched his campaign against Jaya Katuang in the immediate aftermath of the Mongol departure, before his enemy could recover from the shock, before new alliances could be forged, before the usurper could organize any coherent defense against a prince who had just demonstrated he could move empires like chess pieces. The campaign against the internal capital lasted weeks rather than years, because Jaya Katuang understood in the darkest chamber of his own soul that a man who had turned the Mongol horde into his personal instrument of war would face no difficulty at all in turning the armies of Java into an unstoppable wave. Wijaya entered the capital against no resistance worthy of record. The momentum generated by his mythic victory over the Mongols preceded him like a battering ram that opens fortress gates before hands ever reach the iron, because men surrender to those they believe are favored by destiny.
In the year 1295, a mere 2 years after that legendary confrontation on the shores of Java, Raden Wijaya declared the foundation of the Majapahit kingdom and crowned himself its first sovereign, robed in golden silk, the crown of pure gold resting upon the brow of a man forged entirely by the trap he had devised. Majapahit was not merely a kingdom born from the womb of battle. It was an empire carrying a complete civilizational doctrine, its foundations resting on a single iron truth, that Southeast Asia was not a periphery to be colonized by greater powers, but a sovereign beating heart possessed of genius that shamed its would-be conquerors.
At its zenith, Majapahit encompassed territories equivalent to modern Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and regions of Thailand. An empire built not on the annihilation of the conquered, but on maritime trade, civilizational gravity, and the living memory of that singular, impossible victory. The empire was administered with a mind that mirrored its founder's genius. Maritime trade networks built upon mutual benefit rather than subjugation, an administrative structure that incorporated local kings rather than erasing them, a cultural framework that celebrated diversity as a source of strength. Wijaya governed his new realm with the mind of a man shaped by the trap rather than the crown, seeing threats before they fully formed, replacing wars with alliances wherever the calculus permitted, understanding that true empires are built upon the architecture of collective memory, not the scattered bones of defeated enemies. What Wijaya built endured for 2 centuries after his death, 2 centuries during which Majapahit reached its greatest glory under King Hayam Wuruk and the brilliant Prime Minister Gajah Mada, who unified the entire archipelago beneath a single banner of civilizational identity. Wijaya's legacy did not stop at the borders of the empire he founded. He planted within the collective consciousness of Southeast Asia an understanding that had not previously existed, that this geography was not a passage for greater powers to traverse, but an empire complete and sovereign in its own right. The name of Majapahit endures today as far more than a historical relic within the consciousness of modern Indonesia. It is a founding legend, a cornerstone of national identity, and the living embodiment of a single and indestructible idea, that genius is the ultimate weapon, and it answers to no army. The Java trap is studied in strategic studies departments of modern war colleges under a single and resonant heading, enemy force redirection, meaning the doctrine of turning your adversary's own offensive energy against your enemies before igniting the final fatal spark. Wijaya proved what the greatest military theorists have always stated, that numerical balance is not the decisive criterion in warfare, and that the true battle is resolved inside the commander's mind long before the first formation reaches the field. The sword, the shield, and the cavalry, these are the instruments of soldiers, but terrain, timing, and intelligence delivered to the enemy with surgical and deliberate precision, these are the weapons of commanders who redefine war from a synonym for force into a synonym for thought. What elevates Wijaya's deception beyond any conventional ambush is that his enemy was not merely a victim, he was an unknowing collaborator, made to fight Wijaya's war and eliminate Wijaya's domestic rival before the blade turned and the ally became the slaughtered. The military deception Wijaya practiced was not falsehood in its crude form. It was the art of presenting the enemy with complete and accurate truth, but rearranged so that he sees precisely what you require him to see, and remains entirely blind to what breathes in the shadows of the arrangement.
The classical masters of war have always said, the greatest of all victories are those in which the enemy's own soldiers fight against his interests without ever realizing it. And Wijaya achieved this literally, deploying Kublai Khan's iron vanguard to break his domestic enemies at no Javanese cost whatsoever. There are further lessons inscribed in this campaign that remain eternal. The ground upon which you choose to fight is not the backdrop of your strategy, it is the strategy itself, and the commander who owns the knowledge of his terrain already possesses half the battle before a single arrow is loosed.
What the Mongols lost in Java was what they had always considered the one thing beyond loss, their psychological aura, that terrible halo constructed from a century of unbroken conquest, shattered by a mind that understood how to lure it into a ground it could not survive. Later historians recorded that Kublai Khan sat in silence for an entire day upon receiving news of his fleet's annihilation in Java, not because this was his first defeat, but because he understood for the first time that he had been trapped, and that the man who had trapped him commanded no empire of his own. The Mongol army was not defeated in Java by a larger force, nor by a superior weapon, nor by the intervention of weather or fate. It was defeated by the architecture of an idea. Make your enemy fight on ground that nullifies every advantage he possesses and converts all his strength into burden. The conclusion that echoes across the 8 centuries since that battle remains unchanged in every war room that has ever studied it. The true constitution of victory is not written with the sword, it is written with understanding, the understanding of your enemy, your earth, and the singular moment that once passed, time will never return. Wijaya founded an empire and departed, and the crown endured for 2 centuries beyond his death. But what neither departs nor is ever buried is the lesson inscribed in the memory of every serious student of war, that the greatest commanders are those who transform their own defeats into weapons of annihilation. At the end of every military analysis of the Java trap, scholars are left confronting a single and haunting question. How much did Wijaya know before he sent his delegation to the Mongol armada? Did he possess a complete blueprint from the first moment, or merely an opening move that pulled all subsequent logic behind it like iron links of an unbreakable chain? Perhaps the answer lives inside the question itself, that true military genius is never recognized by the perfection of its ending, but by beginnings that appeared random to those who could not read them and formed a single seamless iron doctrine for those who could, built in darkness to illuminate the world in full view of all who remained.